So I'm just honored to be in your presence and to acknowledge what it is that you've done for 20 years. You've chosen to make the world look differently than it currently looks. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So this luncheon is about standing against forgetting that as we celebrate 20 years of ExED. It's an accompaniment that announces a message. What if we were to stand at the margins and because we make a decision to take that stance, the margins get erased? This luncheon is a little bit like what Martin Luther King says about church. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you will go from. And you go from here to reimagine things, especially in the current state in which we happen to find ourselves in this country, a place that's growing alarmingly the opposite of the kinship to which we're all invited, where there is no us and them, there's just us. And so what ExED has really done with this exquisite expertise and with their partners in education, including us at Learning Works and Homeboy, is we've started to galvanize our own imaginations, to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And so somebody like Miranda gets to be brought in. And this is an organization for 20 years that has sought to dismantle the barriers that exclude, which is at the heart of what Bill's initial vision for this was. And so all of us are called to go from this place to stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, to acknowledge that you can't judge a book by its cover, but you can't judge a book by its first chapter either, and to stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear, and those whose dignity has been denied, even though we've all were born wanting the same things, and not all choices were created equal. And so we stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, because our country needs us to do that now more than ever. And we stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And we stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And so we announce a message of kinship and connection and exquisite mutuality, where we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate. And we go from this luncheon to do that. And we brace ourselves, even though the world might well accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And what ExED has done in the last 20 years with their partners is they've broadened our way of seeing so that other voices get heard. All of us are called to go from this place to be enlightened witnesses, people who, through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to this notion about holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up. We kind of just show up and hold the mirror up and tell people the truth. And we all share the same truth, that you are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks who you accompany become that truth. You watch as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it, no 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it, because it's huge. A handful of months ago, I buried my 92-year-old mother, who gave birth to 8 kids and wasn't one bit afraid of dying. In fact, a couple weeks before she died, she was just kind of giddy and kind of ecstatic, and she says, "I've never done this before." Which is something you might say before skydiving. But at her funeral, they had one of my nieces and nephews brought up this license plate, this framed record. And we had discovered when we were kids that she was an opera singer before she decided to have 8 kids. And she had made this one recording on this one clunky record. And the record was "Oh Holy Night." And in it, as kids, I remember we would play the grooves off this thing. And it would say that one line, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth." And yeah, it's about Christmas, and yeah, it's about Jesus, but how is it not the job description of everybody at this luncheon? You appear, and the soul feels its worth. It's how it's supposed to work. That this luncheon is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. So you can hold up the mirror and return people to themselves. But in the process, you're returned to yourself because it is an exquisitely mutual kind of activity. But part of the task always is to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Because that's the principal suffering of the poor throughout history, shame and disgrace. And how do we lift that for each other so that we can mutually be returned to our own dignity? As a priest, I say all my church really is all these detention facilities, so I'm in every single one of them, all the probation camps, juvenile halls. And so I race to like 2 of them on a Saturday. My schedule's always the same. And then I race back to Dolores Mission, where I was pastor and where Homeboy Industries was born 30 years ago. And because I know everybody and homies ask me to do stuff, my Saturdays are always packed in exactly the same way. 1 o'clock baptism, 2 o'clock quinceañera, 3 o'clock wedding, 4 o'clock exorcism. Just checking to see if you're still listening. Every once in a while you gotta check. I've never done one of those, but I raced home and it was like 12:30 when I got to Boyle Heights, and I thought, well, I have time, this was years ago, where I can go and check my mail at our First Street storefront, one of our first offices and headquarters of Homeboy Industries. So there I am, contento, feliz, all by myself reading the mail, when all of a sudden this woman walks in, and I find out her name is Lisa, and I've never talked to her. This is the first time she's ever stepped foot in Homeboy. She's kind of well known on First Street. She was a prostitute, a heroin addict, a gang member, a felon, a parolee. The homies would call her La Gritona because she was always screaming. She would scream at the bartender next door, who would toss her out daily like clockwork at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She would yell into a payphone, "Just let me stay tonight," pleading with friends or family members. And this is the first time she ever steps into my office, and I notice now it's 10 minutes to 1 in my baptism. And she comes right in, she plunks herself down, she kind of looks at all the photographs on my wall, and she launches right in. "I need help," she says. "Oh, I've been to like 50 rehabs. I'm known all over, nationwide." And then she kind of shifts a little. She says, "Went to Catholic schools all my life. Went to elementary. I even graduated from Sacred Heart High School in Lincoln Heights." Then she gets silent and still. And she says, "In fact, first time I ever used heroin was right after I graduated. And I've been trying to stop since the moment I began." And I watch as she leans her head against the wall behind her, and her eyes become like 2 ponds, water rising to meet its edges and spilling over. And she cries, and I let her cry until finally she levels her gaze at me and she says, "I am a disgrace. And suddenly her shame meets mine, because when I had seen her step into my office that afternoon, I had mistaken her for an interruption. We dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that keep us from seeing the truth of who we are, so that the soul can feel its worth. And the measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. And so we choose to make friends with our wounds. Otherwise, we grow tempted to despise the wounded. There was a homie years ago, everybody called him Bandit, and can't remember what his real name was. I think it was Jaime, but we all called him Bandit. And he was a gang member, and I remember I would watch him, and I would ride my bike in the projects at night in Aliso Village housing projects, and he'd ride his bike up to cars and sell crack, and he was into his gang. I'd offer him a job, and a way out, he always declined. Until one day he walked into my office. I couldn't believe my eyes. I say, "Y ese milagro?" And he says what gang members often say, I'm tired of being tired. And so he entered into our 18-month training program, and he worked side by side with enemies, guys he used to shoot at. And we always insist at Homeboy that nobody stop their own education. If they can't read, then learn to. If you haven't finished high school, finish. And he did. He got his GED, and he went on to East LA College. And he was inhabiting the truth of who he was. And then he moved on beyond us to a new job that paid better than Homeboy, which is usually easy to accomplish. And then within 5 years, he was el mero chingón of the whole place. He was kind of supervising this big warehouse, and he was admired. And he bought a home and wife and 3 kids. And then one Friday, he was late. He calls me, and there's a little bit of panic in his voice, and he says, "Gee, you have to bless my daughter." I said, "¿Qué pasó, mijo? Is she sick, or is she in the hospital?" And he says, "Oh, no. On Sunday, she's going to Humboldt College. But that's far, that's way up north, and she's a little chaparrita, and we're afraid for her. Do you think you could give her a blessing before she goes?" I said, "Are you kidding? I'd be honored. Look, tomorrow's Saturday. I have an exorcism at 1. Why don't you come at 12:30? We'll do a little send-off." And so, sure enough, right at 12:30, he and his wife show up, and the 3 kids, including tiny little Jessica. And so I said, "Well, let's stand in front of the altar, and let's put her in the middle. Let's encircle her. Everybody touch her. Everybody put your hands on her shoulder. Go ahead, put your hands on her head." And we all bow our heads, and we close our eyes. And as the homies say, I do a long-ass prayer. I go on. And somewhere in the middle of this prayer, I notice we've all become chillones. We're all blubbering and crying, and I don't know why we're crying exactly, except for the fact that Bandit and his wife don't know anybody who's ever gone to college except me. Certainly nobody in their families. So, I finished the prayer, and we kind of wipe our eyes, and we're laughing about how mushy we got. And to change the subject, I look at Jessica. "Hey, what are you going to study at Humboldt College?" And she was very quick. "Forensic psychology." I go, "Damn, forensic psychology?" And Bandit says, "Yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind." And Jessica looks over at her father, and she does one of these, And he sees her, and he laughs, and he says, "Yep, I'm going to be her first subject." So we go outside, and big abrazos, and the family piles into the car, but Bandit hangs back, and I'm glad he has. And I said, "¿Sabes qué, mijo? Te digo una cosa. I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become, for choosing to walk in your own footsteps. I'm proud of you. And his eyes instantly well up with tears, and he says, "Sabes qué? I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife, a bueno para nada, a good for nothing. I guess I showed them." I said, "Yeah, I guess you did." And the soul felt its worth. Exactly what God had in mind. Don't think for a second that this luncheon is the place you've come to. It's always been the place you would go from, and you go from here to erase the margins by standing at them. You go from here not to make a difference, but to go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. And you go from here and you have ceased to care whether anyone will ever accuse you of wasting your time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And may ExED continue to sing and have other voices heard for the next 20 years. Thank you all very much.